Hello, everyone, and welcome to OpenObservability Talks. My name is Dotan Horvitz. I'm a developer advocate, and this podcast is brought to you by Logs.io. For those new here, OpenObservability Talks is a stream and a podcast where we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. As always, we'll have a chat. I'll have a chat with someone, an expert from the community, from the industry. And then at the last part, we'll have some news and updates worth mentioning. If you have something interesting that you're involved with around these topics, then by all means, reach out to us, and we'd be more than happy to have more community members contributing. So, reach out to us on Twitter at OpenObserve, or to me personally at Horovitz, Horovits, or on the website OpenObservability.io. Whichever works for you, we'd be more than happy to have more people from the community involved and contributing. And for this month's episode, I would like to, I'm glad to host Michael Haberman. Michael is co-founder and CTO of a young startup named Aspecto, dealing with observability for the development, for the pre-production phase of things. So Mike will share a bit more about that with us. Michael is also a veteran in the software industry. He's been through many roles, both as a software architect and as a consultant, escorting many companies, especially around modernizing their architecture and microservices. So we'll probably hear quite a bit about that. And with that, let me add Michael to the stream. Hey, Michael.
Hey. Thank you for having me.
Great having you here, and a personal pride having a fellow Israeli on the podcast for the first time. So way to go! Would you like to hold the episode in Hebrew? Just kidding. Yeah. So Michael, for maybe to start with, instead of the banal question of tell me about your history, I think you've been doing so much with microservices. So maybe interesting to hear about your journey with microservices throughout the different incarnations, if you'd like.
Yeah. So I first started to do microservices as a consultant. I just worked with a company, and they started to do the migration from monolith to microservices. I thought it was very interesting, and so I started to do more and more of those projects. Tons of companies, startups in Israel are going through this transition. Everyone has its own take on what's important and what's not, but the journey usually looks kind of the same at the end of the day. After doing it as a consultant for a few years, I joined a company called Playbuzz, and I was the chief architect there, also doing mostly microservices, and eventually started my own startup around microservices.
Nice. So if you look at your journey with the companies, both as an architect within the company and also consulting others, like, can you depict the typical evolution of companies with the transition from a monolith to a microservice architecture?
Yeah, so usually it starts with something small. So the R&D is very interested in doing microservices, and I think it usually starts from the R&D. And the R&D is able to convince other departments that it's a good transition because we'll be able to release faster, we'll have less bugs, scale won't be an issue. And then they launch the project, and they're doing either a new feature outside of their monolith in microservice environment, or they're taking usually a small, insignificant portion of the microservice of the monolith, break it into microservices. And the first stage is always a success. You have, I don't know, like 2-3 microservices, you release it into production, everybody is happy. It did much faster than the doing changes to the monolith. And everybody looks at it as the great new thing that is going to change everything. And then a few months goes by, and you're starting to have more microservices, and then the problem starts to arise. Problems both for the development aspect and the operation aspect. And I think you can see how the problems evolve and grow as the architecture. The more components you have, the more communication you have between your services, the more issues that you're going to experience in production. And there is this story in the company that is the tipping point where the organization understand that this is a big decision that we took. Not sure if we can go back from that, and now we need to put more resources and more time to make sure that it's actually working.
Yeah, I think I see that very often as well. First of all, it's usually driven by the R&D, the engineering that sees this new trend, a new, more agile way of developing, and creating the decoupling between the different teams and so on. But oftentimes, I feel at least that the ops side of things is not enough in the loop in these points in time, in these decisions, so to speak. They look at the benefits from the development side of things, but all the considerations on the impact on the how to operate it, how to maintain it, how to monitor and gain observability is usually sort of an afterthought of the result. Is that something that you've experienced?
Yeah, very much. I think it starts from the basics of microservices. We used to have this big box containing all of the code all together, and that was complicated to manage. So somebody came with the idea, okay, let's break it into small capsules and everything would be better. But the complexity in the code is far less, that's for sure. But the complexity didn't disappear. It just transferred to a lower level, to the infrastructure layer, to the operation layer. So I think one of the key players that need to be involved in the decision of microservices is the operations, the DevOps, the IT. And they need to do a lot of preparation in this kind of a migration. They need to have different set of tools, different set of knowledge. You may think most companies are doing either containers or serverless. Maybe you don't even have containers in your company. So you have a lot of knowledge, tools, and methods that you need to implement doing microservices. And yeah, I think after doing like 2 or 3 projects as a consultant, I learned that the first thing that I should do before going into the project and starting it, take the DevOps guy, bring him to the meetings, and making sure that involving the decision making.
Yeah, the very benefit of actually bringing everyone to the relevant people to the table, that's a main advantage. And I think also, from what I see, is that oftentimes, even if they don't loop in the operations, you don't get hit the first moment you launch, especially if you're like a small startup or you just took one very defined, product, and only that, if you're a bigger company, and only that was switched to microservices. So as long as it's small, you still don't feel the impact. But as it grows, then suddenly it becomes much more present, all these challenges that you've experienced. So this is why sort of you live in a great world where you started with microservices, everything is great and sweet, but then later on down the road, you as you scale out, you get to get the impact and the results of that, and then it becoming an aftermath to start thinking what's going on. So maybe you started talking about these challenges. So which challenges, if you sort of can recap on from your experience, what are the challenges that they encounter beginning or on the scale out phase, and what they need to adjust?
Yeah, I think I think that the first thing that you need to make sure that you understand both the R&D and the DevOps, maybe even the DevOps first, is you have the ability to understand who is communicating with who. If I have a problem right now, the first thing I need to do, maybe it's to fix it, but before I can fix it, I need to understand it. So if I have high latency of some component out there, I can't just go to that component and fix it. I need to understand the overall impact. Am I affecting other services? Maybe the high latency is not a problem of that service, of it's basically relying on another component. So when you start the microservices, it's easy to remember who is communicating with you because you have like, I don't know, 5, 10 components. When it's getting more bigger than that, you find yourself that you're not sure what is the effect if I have an alert right now. And I think that that would be the first thing that I would do. I think today it's far more easier than it used to be. You have so many commercial products that giving you it just out of the box, monitoring solution mostly. So that would be the first thing that I would do to make sure that I have the right tools to understand what's happening.
And beyond this connectivity, are there any other challenges in terms of like from the operational side there, how to operate, how to manage that, and how to, as you said, how to monitor it from the operations? Because the traditional tools usually aren't fit for the job. So probably it changes quite a bit of the standard ops practices and tooling and things like that. What did you experience as a consultant?
I think that you can predict what you are going to need. Then the architecture evolves, changes all the time, and let's assume that you want to make a change in your in all of your microservices altogether. You want to change the way that you are going to send logs. You want to change the way that you are going to communicate with one another. Making sure you have ability to do cross changes is very, very important. Going manually and doing 5 changes, a bit annoying, but you can do that. Once you have 50, it started to be more than annoying. It started to be a big problem. I think automation is critical at all the layers, from thinking about the environment that you're running, as infrastructure as a code, and how you are going to automate the changes in the code itself. I think those are things that you need to think in advance, because once you have enough services, it started to be annoying. And I remember a DevOps guy and a developer sitting together to create a tool that pulls repositories, make changes, send PR, and it worked and didn't work, and we need to approve each one of them. So automation is critical.
Yeah, I think that's where the strong benefit of the DevOps practices comes to play, because here we've been talking about automation even before microservices, but now it's not a nice to have, it's a must have when you talk about these scales of amounts of services and the frequency of changes. I think it's too dynamic for anyone to do it otherwise.
Yeah.
So maybe you can tell us a bit about which maybe tool sets that you found useful to handle these challenges, and the observability in particular.
Yeah, so I think you have two things that you need to do. First of all, you need to ask yourself, do you have the right tools? So I'm assuming you have something in production environment, and that means that you have some solution for monitoring and APM. Now you need to ask yourself, is this tool fit to what I'm doing? So depending on the product that you chose, some of them are very native to microservices, some of them are doing the transition, some of them are not. I think you need to find a tool that fits your architecture. And I would invest some time making sure that I have the right tool. Tools that I think that are doing a great job in microservices are Datadog, are Lightstep, and Honeycomb. They're doing a lot of work to be compliant with microservices. But you can't just buy everything because it's still new, and you don't have tools for everything. So I think you as an organization need to invest time, both developers and DevOps, to make sure that you have all the data and the tools to handle whatever is going to come at you. And I saw, the very first thing of doing visibility is basically to know who is communicating with who and why and how and in which use cases. So I remember that everybody used to do their own solution for that. So they would write some trace ID or something of that sort into their log solution, and then you had all the logs aggregated by some API call, which is
Pullman tracing, you say?
Pullman tracing, yeah. And I actually really recently, like I think a few weeks ago, met a company that implemented themselves, and then I told them, hey, there is an open source for that, and they were shocked. So yeah, there are tools out there. So you don't need to do your own tracing. So we have solution for that. We have both solution for collecting distributed tracing, OpenTelemetry and OpenTracing, and we also have tools to visualize it. And those would be Jaeger and Zipkin, and I think you need to have those. I think you need to have the ability to have a tool to visualize a specific trace, and it's going to help everybody because it really tells you a story that it's hard to get without it. And also I would say that I think that you need to have access to your traces in different ways. You collect this data, which is priceless. It's telling you everything that's happening between your services. You need to make sure that you have access to it, not only from the point of view of I want to visualize a specific trace, because you may want it for other purposes as well.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because on the last episode we got to host a guy that was part of the team back in Uber when they developed Jaeger, and it was very, very interesting to hear both on how they use it in Uber scale, which is thousands of microservices, which is an amazing scale, and also the practices around that and the challenges of that, introducing that. So it's interesting that you're bringing up Jaeger. So for instance, Jaeger obviously is just a tracing part, and there are other open sources and other components, and some of them, as you said, are not exactly fit for the microservices. For example, Graphite was so popular, the StatsD plus Graphite was the de facto standard for metrics collection. But then again, when it came to the domain of Kubernetes and the microservices architectures implemented on top of that, it started falling apart, and then Prometheus suddenly started to shine on metrics. Definitely, it shuffled up the landscape in terms of tooling and the open source projects and the popularity. But maybe so. you started saying, and you mentioned Jaeger, you mentioned OpenTelemetry. So what is the tool set? And I know it depends probably on different companies you consulted to, but if you can point to like what's the tool set that you've implemented as an architect in your company or as a consultant that you'd say that's a good a package to give you, and then maybe how it met the challenges that you mentioned before, like which parts you're able to cover with these tooling.
Yeah. So overall, I think you have three categories to think about. You need to think about metrics, you need to think about logs, and you need to think about tracing. Metrics, I think everybody has a metric solution. I think it changed, but didn't change dramatically from monolith to microservices. Logs, I think, changed quite dramatically, and tracing is completely new. So talking about, I would start with the logs, because I think it's the simplest. You do have logs. I assume that you do have some kind of a log solution. I think you need to make one change to your logs. Basically, when we have an issue in production, we are we are signed with fixing it, and we're trying to collect the data that we're looking for. And in some cases, you would go to your log solution and find the warning, the error, or whatever you find there. And sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you don't have enough data to fix it by looking at your logs. And now you're a bit stuck. Unless you do something very important, is to write in your log to which trace it was related to. And then you can do the jump from logs to tracing. And this correlation is very important, and it's actually very, very simple. It could be a line of code to have your trace in your logs. And what happened in this scenario is that you're able to jump from log to traces, and now that's what you need to do in order to have traces. So in order to have traces, and I'm talking about a solution that you implement yourself and not taking some off-the-shelf solution. So the first thing you need to do is to collect the traces. Collecting the traces, I would recommend going with OpenTelemetry today. That's what CNCF is putting all the resources on, and that's what most vendors are looking into. And OpenTelemetry, maybe a word about that. OpenTelemetry is an SDK that you implement within your code. And what it does, it can visualize, it can detect what data you're getting into the service, what you're sending to other services, how you communicate with other resources, databases, cache, cloud providers. And when you send it all to central place and you have a link between all the different actions that you took, you basically have this map that you can understand for each API call, how it went throughout your microservices. So this is what OpenTelemetry will do for you. You have an SDK for most programming languages, most modern programming languages. And to do the implementation, it's quite easy. It's an SDK, and this SDK needs to send the data somewhere. So part of OpenTelemetry is not only the SDK that collects the data, it's a collector, which is a backend component that receives the data and can stream it to wherever you're going to tell it to. Our collector is streaming to Elasticsearch. It's a very convenient database to do it. And by the way, that's what the Jaeger recommends, to use Elasticsearch. So, so you have the collector streaming to some database, and you have some tool that allows you to do visibility based on the data, such as Jaeger. And once you have the SDK, collector, and Jaeger installed, this is where you can start to visualize your traces, and you can correlate them with your log solution. And I think this is a must-have to a microservices solution. Without it, you are going to find yourself in a situation that you just don't have enough data to fix the problem or understand what happened.
Yeah, actually, we have an interesting comment or question from our listeners. So, log trace correlation is something which will be built into OpenTelemetry once the logging portions are released in 2021. Today, you have to decorate it, as Michael is saying. So, I think it further validates what you said in terms of. On the one hand, that log trace correlation is the where we're all heading in terms of getting the full observability. So it's also where OpenTelemetry as a project is heading. Admittedly, logs are the farthest away from release. We're now on a release candidate for the tracing. The metrics are also rather mature, a bit behind, but logs are the neglected part so far. So it will take some time, but definitely everyone, I think, in the industry realizes that this is key for that. There is another interesting comment from the audience, a question, sorry. Is it worth the time to adapt and customize tools that exist in the wild, or should you learn which is the least evil to use? I'll let you handle that.
So I'm not sure whether you're talking about customized tools, whether it's something that you implement your own or taking some commercial product. I think choosing a tool that you don't own or you don't have enough ability to change and customize, it's a bit risky, because when we need to choose a tool, basically we ask ourselves, what do we need out from this tool? My guess that you don't know yet, and that's fine, because it takes time to figure out what do you need. So I think that I would start with something that I own, something that I can change. We're talking about OpenTelemetry, Jaeger, those kind of things. The implementation is not that complicated. It doesn't take a lot of time, a lot of effort. And I think it gives you enough flexibility to grow to a certain place. And I think after that, you may need something more mature or that fits your need better, but you also be smarter about that, and you will know what you need.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Jaeger is gave an answer to some of the pains that you mentioned before. So with Jaeger, you have obviously after you've instrumented, you have the SDK in place, everything is streamed via the collector. So, and then you have visibility. You start understanding the things that before were very, very much vague about the relationship between. Can you maybe now say which parts of the pains that you mentioned before were not covered by Jaeger?
Yeah. So I think looking at Jaeger allows you to do 4 main things. It allows you to search your traces. It allows you to for a particular trace ID to visualize your trace, to compare between traces, and to see the overall architecture. Comparing, searching, and all of those are great things once you have a trace and you want to figure out something about it. And the system architecture is something which is, I would give it a nice to have score, because it tells you who is communicating with who, which service communicates with which service, which is important. But when you have something like service A communicates with A and B, service A communicates with B and C. So does it mean that for every action in service A, you're communicating with B and C, or you have specific action that you communicating with B and sometimes you're communicating with C? This resolution that you have will give you better understanding of the real architecture, because we are looking at a service as a one unit, mostly from the DevOps perspective. what is the current CPU, what is the memory consumption, which you're looking at them as a one package, because it is one package, it is one container. Talking about dependencies between microservices, the dependency is not between service to service, it's between action to action. So I would like to get a better drill down on the data that I have. I would like to have, I would like to be able to dive into the details, which will help me to take better decisions, understand better what's going on in my architecture.
So, can you, what kinds of scenarios would you like to, when you say that you are missing, because currently Jaeger has, as you said, beyond the trace specific, you have like the service map, or what's called the system architecture that before they called it dependencies, I think they renamed it at some point, but sort of you can see a graph of the different dependencies. You can zoom in on specific service and see the first circle of dependencies, the inbound, the ingress and outgress and things like that. So like which exactly, I don't know, use cases or standard processes that you would have liked to do and you feel that are not covered?
So let's take an example of PubSub, or let's take Kafka, for instance. So if I'm a producer of a Kafka message, and I would like to know who is going to consume it. So in looking at what I have today in Jaeger, it's a bit complicated for me to know that. Because you may know from the system architecture, depending of how well your app is instrumented, but you may know that this service is sending messages to other services, but maybe it produces a few types of messages. Maybe the Kafka topic changes, and I want to know that this topic is reaching those services, but other topics are to another services. I think that Jaeger is helpful when you're looking at the system overview. It understands the network level of who is communicating with who. But when you drill down into PubSubs and you drill down to things that requires a bit more analytics on the data, you can't get that from Jaeger. And to circle back to what I said, that I think you need to own the data, and you think that you need to have access to this database. And Elasticsearch in the example that I gave. So if you do have access to the raw data, you're able to do those things. You're able to write some query, write some script to access this data and figure out what can I understand more from this data, and not only what Jaeger did the UI for.
Yeah, actually, I think it's something that we also, I also see that with our engineering, for instance, that are very geared towards the usage of the Elk stack and Kibana and Elasticsearch. So they find it very easy, oftentimes, to look at the span data from the prism of Kibana and start just querying that just to query logs, because it's much more powerful and rich in terms of the fine grain investigation than what you can do on Jaeger. So I think actually it's something that I also see, and we also see, like the combination of the tools yields something that gives you a much more holistic observability into your system. Some of what you're describing here is somewhat similar, or at least sounds like to some of the audience probably rings a bell into the realms of APM, application performance monitoring. Some of the APMs even started from these phases of the development sides of things. So maybe interesting. What's your perspective? Is that something that is covered by APMs? Are there gaps, or how does that relate to the APM market and offering?
Yeah. So first of all, I think APM is changing. because we used to have more monolith application, now we have more distributed applications or microservices. So I think APM is in this transition. So I think APM, when we need to ask ourselves what questions does it answers, and when do we ask those questions? So usually we go to APMs regarding issues that we have in production, or that we are looking for a specific metric around performance. So I now have high latency in some endpoint, so APM will detect that. APM will tell me what used to be the latency, what's the latency now, what are the effects about CPU and memory, and it also would tell me, it would show me a graph saying that the reason for the latency is, I don't know, a DB query. And if it's a very good APM, it may even tell you that it misses some index in the database. So it's taking the developer and trying to help him with one API that is now misbehaving, and we need to figure out and we need to fix it. And I think solutions like Jaeger, they're not looking at what happened in this API call. It's looking at how this API call propagated throughout other services and what was their effect. So I think APM currently are still focused on what's happening in the process, rather than looking at the overall picture. I do believe that some vendors are more moving to looking at the entire picture and not being in the process, but I think it's still a bit missing.
So if you look at I think this is also the focus of your startup Aspecto. So you're looking squarely at the pre-production phase. So you're looking at sort of the developers' standard practices and trying to enhance these parts for developers working on microservices. So can you maybe explain what kinds of specific flows? If I'm a developer now developing a microservice, where in my day-to-day flows, which day-to-day flows in the development, QA, I don't know which parts you tell me, where I can actually leverage more observability into my system and my code and its behavior in production or in behavior in staging? You tell me what kinds of visibility we're trying to gain.
Yeah, so tracing data can tell you what's really happening with your application, and we can take a lot of example. Let's take something quite simple. So you are writing a unit test, and this unit test needs to communicate with some external API. It is a unit test, so we want to do some mock or stab. So now what do you do? How do you get this mock? So if you're a lazy developer, you just look at the code, assume what it's going to return, and create your mock. Maybe you have a bit more motivation and you are running the actual API call, grabbing it, maybe even simulating few cases, whether it's fail, whether it's going to work. And eventually you did you guessed, you hoped that you found the interesting cases, the important one, and your unit test is only good as your mocks, right? Because if in real life you're not going to get the actual response as if you will got in the mock, this unit test is simulating something that is not going to happen, or it's not very common. So if I were able to know for sure what are the use cases, what are the different mocks that I should simulate, my test would be more accurate, and it would just be better and more sustainable throughout time. So what I would recommend, before reminding my startup, I would recommend to go to Elasticsearch or the database that you chose and run a query for, I don't know, the last 7 days for this particular data that you're looking for, and can analyze it, understand it, and create mocks based on that. Now your mocks are based on production data. They are more accurate, and it's going to be very interesting for you, because I know developers that do it in our company, that they sometimes find themselves finding something that they didn't thought of, or just see this trace that some other service is communicating with that as well, and I didn't thought about this use case. So you're actually looking at the source of truth of what's happening in your application and converting it into mock. And mock is just an example. You can convert it into all kind of other things. But doing this process is going to make sure that it's really accurate. And one thing that you need to think about, once you committed this mock, when will be the next time that somebody is going to review it and say, is it still what's really happening in production, or maybe this mock is deprecated? And this is, I think, where tools are going to arise and help you and notify you that your test passed. That's cool, but your test is deprecated. You need to alter your mock. You need to change it. You need to make sure that it's still what's really happening. It could be mocks. It could be, what do I need to test? What use cases in my, let's say, my API testing? What do I need to test? Now I know that my service responded with 500. Okay, what was the payload that I need to send to get this 500 use case, which is probably an important use case because some user didn't like this 500. So so you can do tests, you can do mocks, you can do traffic replay based on that. You can generate your API documentation based on that. Endless amount of options. And if you just have this Elasticsearch and you just make your developer aware and you tell them, okay, spend another hour on that task, but do look at what's really happening, you will just get better results.
So essentially use the production environment and the actual operation as the guidance to the developers on how to then guide their development for the next release of that microservice or similar.
Yeah, exactly.
One question you're saying, so as long as you have the data in Elasticsearch and you can query, but I'm wondering, what's the dependency on the quality of the actual data that you get from the instrumentation? At the beginning of the conversation, we started talking about OpenTelemetry and about other types of instrumentation, maybe even proprietary vendors. There is, I assume, some sort of dependency on the level of quality and elaboration of the data that you receive there, right?
Yeah, so your traces are only as good as what you collect. And looking at how OpenTelemetry works, you have the basic stuff that you get with OpenTelemetry by default. Mostly would get native modules like HTTP. When it comes to more specific libraries and modules that you use, like your database driver or your Redis driver or whatever, you may need to do it manually to add this plugin manually. Plugins are something that the community develops and maintain.
And you're developing some of the plugins yourselves and contributing to the open source.
Yeah. So we mostly are working around Node.js, and we developed a plugin for the AWS SDK and for Kafka.js and for TypeORM. And we did that because either we needed that or a customer needed that, and we are very happy to share it with everybody. And you know, if you look at the flow and you're communicating with, I don't know, Cassandra as a database, and you don't have the plugin for Cassandra, now you have a missing piece. But when the developer or the DevOps going to look at this trace, it's not going to say that there's a missing piece. It's just going to look at the trace and assume that this is what's happening. I remember once that somebody told me, I think there is a bug. I say that we're doing get from Redis, and it's empty, and then we're doing set, and suddenly the data is there, and I don't know where it came from. So yeah, it had a missing plugin to know what happened with your database. So I think, and there's more problems with not only the plugin themselves. When it's coming to async communication, it's getting a bit more complicated to do distributed tracing. So I would say that you can start with off-the-shelf and just add more plugins. You always have the ability to just instrument stuff yourself, send spans and traces based on what you want to instrument. And I think you can either, if you have a lot of time, free time, you can do a plugin. If you don't have a lot of time, you can just do manual instrumentation. And it should be good enough. It is a bit of an effort for an R&D to really understand that they can't rely 100% on traces. They need to keep an open mind that it may not be 100% accurate, and then go ahead and fix it.
Yeah, makes sense. We're about to run out of time. I have one more question, but maybe it's an opportunity to ask our listeners. If you have any more questions on the live streams, on Twitch, on YouTube Live, do send us through so we can have Michael addressing them before we finish this part. So if to wrap it all up, now if you can maybe give your best practices, and also obviously what your product is going to give as a product instead of manual work. How would you say that the easy life of developers in this age?
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, developers they need to have feedback from production. And understanding how their software is really being used from the very technical perspective. And we don't have access to it very easily. I think the most easy thing that we can do is to write logs, but you need to first know what you're looking for, and then write it, and then deploy it. I think that being able to get this feedback loop from production, and to take this insight to really understand components and how they're interacting with one another, to really understand dependencies from the developer point of view. I don't care that service A is communicating with a bunch. I really care about this message, this WhatsApp that I'm going to publish, and I want to know who's going to consume it, because if I'm making a breaking change, I need to go to all of those consumers and make sure that they're still working. So we need to have a really deep dive into the details. And basically, this is what we're trying to do in Aspecto, and we're trying to help the developer while they're developing. And we're basing that on production insight. And we also think that we're able to give you today to understand the changes that you're making locally, compare them to production environment, try to assess the impact of that, and also tell you, hey, you covered a bunch of cases in your local, in your testing, which are great, but you're still having a missing piece that does occur in production, but you don't reproduce them. You need to add tests to that. So, there is a lot of things to do around that, and I think it's far more easier today for a developer to get instant feedback from production and to assess what's going to happen. So I think that's important.
We actually have a good question around these practices, more focused on, I think, on the sampling. So the question is, what's the best practice for balancing sampling rates for traces between testing and production environments? And how important is it to capture 100% of data during the initial build?
Yeah, so sampling is quite complicated. It even could be a bit more complicated than you think of that initially, because if you look at a trace, you may get certain portion of it instrumented, and some of them that wasn't instrumented because they were not sampled. So I think that you want 100%, right? That's the easy answer. The more you have, the better data that you're going to have in the end of the day. And it really depends on your production environment, how painful it is for you to have this 100% of instrumentation. And there is a performance impact to OpenTelemetry that's of course. I would say definitely in staging, dev, those kind of environment, run with 100%. It's not going to affect anybody. In your production environment, I would do sample rates less than 100 in where it is really intensive. And I would go to something around, and I'm talking about really intensive environments. I would go to around 50%. That means that you're getting one case out of them. We did something in Aspecto that I think it's quite interesting. We're doing sample rate not based on the so once you implemented OpenTelemetry, you can specify the sampling for all of the operation altogether. So you have one number for all of the operation, but not all of the operation of your microservices has the same importance and the same amount of traffic. So basically, what we're doing dynamic sampling. We're understanding how much traffic you're getting, how much different variance you're having for each endpoint, and based on that, we're deciding what's the sample rate.
Yeah, well, sampling, I think, is a whole huge topic that deserves its own episode. A lot of the head-based and tail-based and static rate versus dynamic, and lots of things. So maybe I'll ask you to have a follow-up specifically on that topic. So I want to thank you very much, Michael, for joining me for this episode. It's been fascinating, and you gave us a lot of perspective about how microservices work, maybe the dark sides of microservices that people tend to talk about. So thank you very much for coming and joining me here.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now, with that, I would like to move on to the next part, which is the news and updates from the industry. So I have several things that I wanted to share with you today. One directly relates to what we just discussed now about OpenTelemetry, which is that the tracing portion, the tracing specification of the OpenTelemetry has reached what is known as the RC, the release candidate. So that means that it's now considered frozen, although some of the parts are still beta, but officially, at least now, it's supposed to be without any breaking changes going forward. We should have the APIs, the SDKs, the collectors should be nearly completed. So in the coming few weeks, we should be starting to have these coming out, and then obviously after these are out, the focus would be on productization and GA readiness. So that these are good news. The tracing is one of the more advanced pieces of the OpenTelemetry, as we said. Metrics are a bit behind, but the expectation for both of them is to be GA'd by the end of the year, and logging for next year. So these are actually good news. And another piece of news related to OpenTelemetry is AWS's announcement that happened a week ago or so, that they released a public preview of what they call the AWS distro for OpenTelemetry. That's pretty interesting. I have to admit, personally, when I heard the name AWS distro, the immediate association that I had, it immediately associated with AWS Open Distro, where AWS forked Elasticsearch, the open source, and it was quite shocking for the open source community around that, and is still a source of controversy on some forums, but interesting to see where AWS is going to take this distro for OpenTelemetry to. It's pretty fresh, obviously, so not much of information, but still some talks about whether it is going to be a fork in the sense of splitting the open source community, and some talks about disabling features which are part of the standard distro on their distro. So definitely it would be interesting to see what's going on that respect. Another interesting thing that I wanted to mention was also released earlier this month was an open source called PromScale. If you know Timescale DB, then it's from the same family, and this is a new open source based on Timescale and in combination with Postgres. It's supposed to provide obviously a long time storage for Prometheus with large scale, but then again also address the analytics part, being able to ask more sophisticated queries based on SQL syntax, and being able to sort of claim, working in high, I'm looking at the numbers, 10 million metrics per second, they reported petabytes of storage. So it should be on the one end, then the classic backend long-term storage, but on the other end with the twist of providing the analytics. Again, it's a new open source, so although they say it's been around in one way or the other for a few years, so interesting to check this one out. I believe that we're about to run out of time, so I'll leave some of the other news maybe to the next episode. But definitely, I would like to thank you all for being with us today, joining me here. Thank you again, Michael, for providing a lot of insight about microservices. The recording of the episode will be available on your favorite podcast app, and do follow us to check out the next month's episode. We have monthly episodes. They're broadcast live, streamed on Twitch and YouTube, and then you can join also and share some of your questions. You can find all the details on OpenObservability.io on the website, or again, you can reach out to us over Twitter and follow us at OpenObserve, or again, you can also reach out to me at Horovitz, HOROVITS. And again, if you have something interesting to talk about, some topic that you'd like to discuss, we'd be more than happy to have more community members involved in the podcast, in the community. So reach out, submit a talk, propose something, and we'll definitely be happy to have you on the podcast. So I'm Dotan Horovitz, and thank you very much, and looking forward to seeing you again on next month's episode. Thank you.